Bismillahi walhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. We welcome everyone to this new and exciting program in which we're going to cover fundamentals in marriage preparation based on uh, Islamic principles and based on the experiences that we have here as a community of belief in the United States. We're basing ourselves on the book or this course is rooted and founded on the course that is constructed from a book which is called Before You Tie the Knot. And this is an interesting book that was compiled some time ago. And the book is a collaboration between an imam and a social worker. And they bring in their experiences in dealing with counseling and dealing with community issues as it pertains to marriage. And so the book, in and of itself, is not taking on the subject of marriage solely from the angle of rules, what is allowable, what is not allowable, or what's my right and what's not my right, or what do I owe to others. The book looks at the role of the individual in marriage and the relationship between those two people that want to get married. And it brings a series of examples from people's lived experiences for every section that is dealing with to give the understanding of marriage life so that it's something that we can relate to. And by bringing these examples, the idea is to teach us what direction we should be going in when it comes to marriage. The general outline of the book is rooted in firstly giving us an introduction on how to use the book. And then we start off with presenting the Quranic model for marriage. And this is something which, after some reading and some reflecting on this chapter, there's some necessity or there's some need to expand more on what's being said because there's some things that I feel that are missing. But after presenting that Quranic model for marriage, it gives us the book gives us a guideline. Firstly, we jump into the subject: Are you getting married for the right reason? And so there we begin to have a point of reflection on why it is that people get married. Then, after we go through that reflection, we jump to factors that we should be considering when choosing a spouse. And then the more difficult question of how do you find this a potential spouse, which I think that is one of the most pressing issues which many people face in today's time. Then we get into more conventional or more well-known things like the role of the family, the concept of the wedding, what are elements of a successful marriage, and what are essential skills that people need to have for a successful marriage, issues of finances and other issues. And then there's this famous 100 question premarital questionnaire, which Imam Muhammad Haq Majid, he compiled. And so we are going to begin firstly with looking at a definition of what is marriage before going into something which is more complicated, like what are the objectives of marriage and so on and so forth. But we want to talk about what is marriage, and here we're using another text to give us a good definition and insight. I like the way that the ayat of the Quran have been translated. There's some overlap between the ayat of the Quran that have been used in the introduction in the first chapter of the book Before You Tie the Knot in this book. So there's some alignment, so to speak, or they relate to each other. Firstly, we have to have the understanding that we live not isolated. One of the key things that we need to understand about ourselves as human beings is that we don't come into this world as individuals. We come into this world as being part of a community, and we live in a society, right? That's important to understand. And so we play a function in our families and we play a function in our communities. And part of that function that we play is that we have a role, we have a set of relationships that we operate in. That's important to understand. If we're not clear on that understanding, then we get the marriage idea wrong, because then the marriage idea only becomes about me. We have to understand marriage is bigger than just me. Marriage relates to myself and how it is that I relate to another person, and how it is that we together relate to our families, and how it is that we're part of a community of belief and part of a society, and so on and so forth. And so one of the key ideas is that the family is the most essential unit of society. And in order to have a strong ummah, and when we talk about ummah, we're talking about the concept of a Muslim community of belief. And even to have a society that is healthy, you have to have solid families. So here the author says the attainment of a perfect society depends on perfect families. And we would like to say healthy families, because perfection is not going to exist. But the idea of trying to aim at what does that look like? A perfect family, so to speak, because you want a perfect society. That's a good reflection. So he talks about how Islamically, scholars of the past, they always devoted part of their discussions in Islamic knowledge on the idea of family. Most always took the angle of speaking about the rules, but not all, because you can find in some scholarship in the past where there's this discussion on the role of family and the role of society and the role of community. In other words, Muslims in the past just didn't focus on what is halal and what is haram, or what is allowable and what is prohibited, but they focus on understanding the individual human being. And you find a lot that was written, just like in today's time, you find things on, the psychology of parenting, the education of children. You find conversations about sexual intimacy. You find conversations about the role of emotions. That's what you find today. You in the past found similar things, maybe not in the same way because the needs were different in the times past. But in other words, when we talk about marriage, we can't just talk about a contractual relationship, and we just can't talk about what is your role, what is my role, what I owe you, what you owe me, and that's it. We have to understand that there's emotions at work. We have to understand that there's needs that people have. We have to understand that there's certain skills, like we have to develop communication skills. We have to have the ability to resolve conflict. Marriage is more than just we come together if we have X amount of money in place, or if we have sexual desire, then we get married. Marriage is about building a relationship which is going to either bring benefit to those that are around that relationship, or is going to collapse in upon itself and is going to cause problems for the bigger community, and also create problems if there's children. So that's something that we have to keep in mind, that we have to understand that marriage is more than just rights and responsibilities. Marriage is more than just thinking about what individuals want, and marriage is foundational. Marriage is foundational. One of the things that the Quran teaches us is that from the signs of Allah wa ta'ala is that He created for us from the same origin companions, right? Mates, that we can incline towards them and find rest in them. And then Allah or God put love and tenderness between us and mercy, right? And then the Quran itself talks about this relationship as being from the signs of God for those of us who reflect. And that ayah of the Quran, it comes in the context of Surah Al-Rum, in which Allah wa ta'ala is talking about the greater signs in the creation, which point to the existence of God, the signs that are in the universe, right? And then we begin to see the signs of family, and all of that is being spoken about in the context of resurrection, showing that we're accountable. The Surah Al-Rum, interestingly enough, it was revealed in the time period where the Muslims were making migration. They were leaving, beginning to leave Mecca because of persecution and not having the ability to have healthy families and healthy communities. They were going to an environment in which they could establish themselves. And it was revealed in a time period where the Muslims were beginning to lose their families because of belief, And so the surah itself is pointing to the people of the book, in this case, the Byzantine Empire, in which it seemed that they were defeated in that time period, but that their defeat will be temporary, and then they would come back, right? That they would not be, that they would not stay defeated. And so some of the scholars reflect upon that to say that we should not judge events and situations at face value, that we should look to understand that which is permanent, that we should understand that life itself is guided by a process. It's guided by the command of Allah and the promise of Allah. And that in this world, there's a certain understanding that we should have about life, about our origin, about the importance of our actions, and that goodness is rewarded, and that there is a life that comes hereafter, that we're accountable to God for what it is that we do. So in this context of not judging things at face value, of understanding that we're going to come to account, of understanding that at the end, those who do good are rewarded, and understanding that the creation itself speaks to us about life and death and how it is that God will bring us back from the dead and reward us, and also present to us a new life. And in that new life, we either will be those who achieve a better station, or we will be of those who have to account for our bad deeds, and we may have to spend some time in discomfort. In other words, there's this idea of paradise, and there's this idea of hell, this idea of goodness, and this idea of punishment for what it is that we do. So within this context, Allah wa ta'ala is talking to us about the idea of having spouses, and mentioning to us that it's natural for us to incline to a spouse. But not only that, but there's a purpose for that relationship. Just like the world itself that we live in has a purpose, just like life itself has a purpose, just like events at the end, they have a purpose. At first, we may not be able to see the value. We may not be able to understand why it is that certain things take place, but there's an underlying purpose. Marriage itself has purpose. And that purpose, firstly, is for people to find tranquility in their spouses. And with that tranquility, the space is opened up to experience love and mercy and tenderness. So that's the core of the relationship. And then from there, we find that in that environment that is wholesome, from that marriage bond, which is committed, from that set of relationships, which is supposed to be fair and just, in which people are supposed to have some compassion and understanding with each other, in which they share in life realities, in which they support each other by reminding each other about the purpose of this life and what is goodness and what direction that the family should be headed in. Children are raised. And when children are raised in that type of environment where there's security, where there's love, where there's tenderness, where there's recognition of human dignity, where there's understanding and comprehension, and when there is that tenderness that is necessary for human beings to feel loved and for human beings to encounter acceptance, then that child is raised in that environment, which is wholesome. That child becomes ready stage by stage to be a member of society and to contribute not only to the biological reproduction of humanity, but to the spiritual reproduction of humanity and maintenance of humanity. And one of the things that the author says here is that the factory is not a family for the production of children. Rather, it is the most essential part of society and the first seed of a nation. Now, when we look further and we look to what it is that is said in the book before you tie the knot, especially in the section when it talks about the Quranic model. In that section, there's a subsection which deals with the objectives of the Sharia. When we look to the objectives of the Sharia, meaning the purposes of the Sharia, the aims, the goals, why it is that Islam legislates certain things. In that discussion, we have an Imam Tahir ibn Ashur, and others. In that line of reasoning, they look at the family in part as one of the most essential functions is the biological reproduction of humanity. Now, I want to say something, especially in this time period in which there's a lot of debate on gender, and some of it is not debate because some of it has been decided by law, but for us, it remains a point of debate because not everything that is in popular culture we necessarily agree with. But we have to really be clear that when we look at marriage, we have to understand that sex is an essential part of marriage. And we have to look at the role of sex, right? Here he's talking about the family is not a factory for the production of children, but the production of children is an essential part of the marriage bond. But not everyone, of course, is going to be able to have children. You understand what I'm saying? So that doesn't mean that they're deficient as a couple because they don't have children. It could just be the command, basically the qadr of Allah, the determination of God, that there's some reason why they're prevented from having children. But we have to be clear that in how we understand the marriage union or the marriage relationship, it is fundamentally between the male and the female, because part of what we call to be marriage is not just the expression of love between two people. Part of what we call marriage is the expression of love between male and female, and part of that relationship is that relationship opens up to having children. We do have a certain unique understanding of the marriage bond and of sexuality and of what love is between two people in terms of male and female, just like we have an understanding of what love is between male and female, and those are we call brotherhood and sisterhood bonds, or we call those familial bonds, right, that are non-sexual. They could be bonds that are between father and son, mother and daughter, or they could be aunt and niece, or uncle and nephew, or they could be friend and friend. But those are not sexual relationships for us. The sexual relationship for us is a relationship which is coming within the bonds of family, and sexuality is not just limited to the production of children for us, but part of sexuality, which is very essential, it is the production of children. And that's where we differ with some of the discussions that are taking place in the society, right? Outside of, Islamic circles, the idea is that it's possible to express love in a sexual way between two people of the same sex. And for us, we say no, sexuality, part of it is the issue of being open to life coming by way of the sexual act. Right? And so part of the family is the production of children, right? But fundamentally, what's being said is also that it's the foundation of society, and for us, the foundation of the ummah. So if it's the foundation of the ummah, we have to be open to that possibility that, biological life is going to come out of that. And because we have a role that we're playing. And the role that we're playing in the marriage is that we're having children and we're raising those children to have an understanding of the deen, to be carriers of the deen, to be carriers of the values of revelation, right? And so that's not possible we're not going to be able to educate a new generation to be carriers of the deen within the context of the family if we're not open to the issue of the production of children. And also, that brings us into the discussions that are also taking place in the society when it comes to the issue of the regulation of childbearing. The issue, what does it mean when we value freedom to such an extent that we completely control childbirth to the point where we prevent it 100% without a legitimate reason. In other words, the issue of abortion, right? And so family planning, it has its role and it has its place. But I want to make this a little more simple, and I want to come back to say that the family is not solely for the production of children, but having children within the family is essential. Some may not be blessed with the ability to have children, and we shouldn't make them feel guilty. But we also have to have an understanding that the family is that means by which the ummah reproduces itself and is the foundation for the ummah. And part of that unit, which we call the family, which is most essential, part of that reality of the family unit is that it educates new life, which is the children. And before being able to do that, it has to be able to bring them into existence. And part of bringing them into existence is by the sex act. And so we have in the advice of the Prophet Muhammad, من يستطيع منكم الباء فليتزوج. يا معاشر الشباب من يستطيع منكم الباء فيتزوج. So here the Prophet ﷺ is speaking to the younger generation. And we have to understand that the concept of shab or shabab is everything that's basically 40 and below, technically speaking, right? Technically speaking. And so we're looking how it is that the Prophet ﷺ is guiding the members of the Ummah, that whoever has the ability, and here the idea of ba is looked at in two ways. One is sexual energy. Whoever reaches that point of having sexual energy, or whoever has the material means, right? Both meanings are there in the hadith because of the different narrations for the hadith. And so having the economic means and also being at that point where people have the biological energy to get married, right? Then we should incline towards marriage and facilitate that process of marriage, right? And so marriage is one of the weightiest contracts that we have in Islam, if not the weightiest. And it brings two people together that were not from the same family most of the times. They are from two different families. And it brings them together. In other words, these two people together that, basically they're not considered mahram. Basically, they're considered to be strangers to each other. It brings them together and creates and forges a union between them. And that union between them is a union in which they find tranquility between each other or amongst each other. And then love develops, is put in that relationship by God, and mercy and tenderness. And so then from that union between two strangers to each other, people that are eligible to marry each other, comes a fortified relationship. And from that fortified relationship emerges children. and there's a bonding between peoples. There's a bonding between peoples, and that's when you begin to see that there's this idea in which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, He created us. خلقنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى. Right? That Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala created us from males and females. Right? And from those males and those females created communities and tribes with the idea of coming to know one another, يتعارفوا. And so this idea of coming to know one another is an important concept, the issue of ta'aruf. Because those two people that they encounter one another, they're marriageable candidates, they come from two different backgrounds. They come from two different family experiences, sometimes two different cultures, right? Different psychologies. And so not only are we compatible with each other at the biological level, and that's something that's natural, that we come together and we incline towards each other. There's the instinctual liking. Sometimes, the biological attraction is there. We find the other person handsome, or we find the other person, beautiful. But there's also this idea that we, have to have in mind that we were created with certain differences, but those differences are overcome the more that we come to understand each other. And so the marriage bond gives us that opportunity to bridge those differences. And most of all, before we can bridge differences between families and peoples and tribes, the husband and wife have to come to know one another and educate each other, right, on the realities of how those differences work. Males and females have certain distinct qualities and have also some qualities that overlap with each other, certain qualities that are in common. Marriage in the Quran and the Sunnah is given great importance. And what we mentioned before is that the Prophet ﷺ even encouraged the youth to marry, and he laid down some of the reasons. He says, "Oh, young people, whoever can marry among you should marry." And here there is a clear guidance on how it is that we deal with sexual energy, because it helps in keeping one's eyes down and guarding one's chastity, right? And so that's something that is important to understand, right? So there's the benefits of marriage come with security, they come with tranquility, mutual concord. In other words, being able to work together in harmony, right? And so when that security and tranquility is in place, and when people are able to cooperate, تعاونوا على البر والتقوى ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان, as the Quran says, the Quran commands to cooperate in goodness and in establishing what it is that is commanded by Allah to establish, and don't cooperate with each other in sin and destruction. And so when that is in the context of a family, when that stability is there, when people are working to support each other in goodness, then that reflects in society as a whole. So the author here says that, marriage is that when it's understood properly, and I'm adding that piece, it could prevent the moral collapse of society. And we say the community overall, the ummah, right? The stability that we need to have in the ummah is only going to come when the family is stabilized. And the family can't be stabilized if people don't understand marriage, if people don't understand the role of marriage, if people don't understand themselves and how it is that they relate to each other, and what is the Quranic understanding of the human being. And we have to be clear on this, because there's some understandings of the human being that may be in society, and people are free to think how they may want to think. But we ourselves as Muslims, we have certain parameters and certain principles and values, a certain paradigm, a certain model that we operate in. And so in that Quranic model tells us things about human beings, and it tells us things about family life, and it tells us things about male-female relations that other people may not believe in, and that's fine. And so some of us, and that's one of the reasons why I started off with the issue of sexuality. Some of us, we're scared as to what's going on in society, but then when it comes to us understanding ourselves on the Quranic model, what does it mean to be a Muslim male, a Muslim female, a Muslim man, a Muslim woman? What does it mean to have a family? What does it mean to establish that family? What is the role and responsibility of that family to the education of the children that come? What is the responsibility and the relationship of that husband and wife to each other? What is the role in understanding each other emotionally, intellectually? And what is the role of sex in that relationship? And what are certain things to be expected other than just talking about the issue of someone paying the bills or someone to afford going into that relationship and constructing it? In other words, what is the meaning of the relationship of marriage? If we're not clear on those things, then our fear for what goes on in society is a fear that is delusional, right? Because it's a fear that is going to lead us to disorient ourselves, and it's a fear that is going to lead us to not have anything to be grounded on, because what are we going to find security in? If marriage itself, one of the objectives is security, right? We find that the Quran talks about يعني خلق لكم من أنفسكم أزواجا لتسكنوا إليها, right? The idea of السكون is the idea of tranquility. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is saying that from the same origin, our counterparts were created so that we can live in tranquility. And that tranquility has a lot to do with security, and it has to do with being at peace within that space that we call the family. If we can't find security and peace in the idea of marriage, if we think of marriage only that which is hardship, if we think of that which is problematic, to be family, if we think of the male and the female relationship to only be conflict ridden, then at the end of the day, we won't have anywhere to rest. There's a lot of things to be said, but I wanted to move forward and just talk a little bit about how this book works, and then we will move on to in the next session to the Quranic model, which is going to take us a little bit of time. The idea here, again, that we're going to keep in mind is that from the signs of Allah, that He created companions from the same origin as ourselves, right, with the purpose of dwelling in tranquility with them. And He has put love, engendered love, created love, and the conditions, right, are in place for love and mercy to be generated between us. And in that, those are signs for people. And the introduction, they give a case study. I'm not going to go over the case study other than to say that it's a case study which has two stories. The story of one couple that is excited about getting married, but then they become fearful because they hear about another couple that they know that ends up going through divorce. And so it creates a sense of instability, right? And so what happens to the new couple which is excited, or the couple that is excited about getting married, when they hear about that couple their relationship crash, they become disoriented and destable. So that's why, it's important for people to understand how to construct marriage so that they can have a relationship which is healthy, and so that they can be in a position to be able to avoid the same issues that people have that lead to the collapse of their relationships and sometimes the collapse of themselves. And so with that idea of developing a strong ummah, and with that idea of preparing our youth to still have hope in marriage, we present this book, and that's one of the reasons why this book has been written. But as I mentioned before, it's been written before the book, Before You Tie the Knot. It's been written not just focused on halal and haram, right? But focus on the idea of what's known about psychology and relationships and what is practical in the context of Muslim American family life and society, right? And so another thing that comes up to play is that a lot of us, when we read books in fiqh or when we read about marriage, we have these ideas like the whole concept of qawwama, or the whole concept of the role of man or the role of the man. But then when it comes to implementing them, we don't know how to work that out. We hear about the idea of consultation and how it's fundamental in the Quran, and that our affairs should be conducted by consultation. We're even commanded, شَوَّرَهُمْ fil amr, in the Quran to consult one another in our affairs. But then in family life, it kind of breaks down the idea of leadership. We don't know what that exactly means. We don't know what cooperation means. We don't know what happens when two people bring salaries into the household. Who's in charge? Who's not in charge? Do they both have equal decision making or not? Can the husband prevent the wife from seeing her family? Can the wife have a career? Can the wife uh, make decisions without consulting the husband, especially when it comes to her health issues? When it comes to, in other words, we have created a situation now where we're not clear on how to relate to each other, right? And so it's part of the reality that we live today, where we're facing challenges and problems when it comes to decision making and how we relate to each other, and when it comes to the issue of the sexual life in the relationship, when it comes to the issue of communication, when it comes to the issue of in-laws, when it comes to the issue of family planning, when it comes to the issue of career. All those things are a struggle. So the book is here to help guide us in a more practical way so that we can deal with the issues that we actually confront. And so the aim is to prepare couples to have a clear understanding of what marriage is and to prevent conflicts that can be worked out by seeing pitfalls and anticipating issues before they arise, right? So we're looking to gain an awareness of ourselves and an insight to what's most important for ourselves as individuals and couples, to be clear on those things which are destructive to a marriage, to be able to avoid them or to avoid them, those issues, or navigate them, or you work through them, and really be able to identify and recognize what constitutes a real problem. Not what I think is a problem, not what I feel is a problem, but what constitutes a real problem in a marriage, right? And so, one of the things that is suggested for reading this book, we find that the first chapter gives a general framework, which is the chapter which talks about the Quranic model, and we said we're going to go a little deep into that so that we have, a solid foundation. So one of the things that is essential is to first read that chapter carefully and reflect upon it. We'll be doing that together. And at the end of each chapter, one of the things that we find that has been done in this book is that there is a summary, like a conclusion, and then there's some questions for reflection and discussion. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at those questions, reflection, and discussion first, along with the summary, before we summarize the chapter ourselves, right? And that is going to be the model that we take, overall, because then that way we'll look at the questions, we'll reflect upon them for a little bit. That way we have something to think about before just jumping into the material. And then before jumping into the material, we want to summarize what it is that has been said. Then we'll try to go into some details, right? And so each chapter has questions to reflection, for discussion and reflection. And these questions should be things that we're thinking about when it comes to the issue of marriage. Now, the 100 questions that Imam Majid put together, the questionnaire, that's something which, in reality, when people want to get married, that's a questionnaire which by the time they're aiming to get married, most of those questions should have been answered for them. You don't have to sit down and necessarily do 100 questions in one sitting. But the 100 question concept is there to kind of give us an understanding. I personally don't agree with the idea of giving somebody 100 questions right away and saying, okay, fill this out for me. I don't agree with that. And I'm going to tell you why I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that because anybody can sit down and fill out what they want. They can say whatever they want. Also, you may have the person fill it out and you may misunderstand what they're saying. And because of the way that the questionnaire looks, you may write them off. That happens. It has to come with time, people. That's why when you are intending to get to know somebody, you should be clear on how serious it is. Something should have opened you up for you to commit to that process of getting to know that person with the intention of seeing if you're compatible to be married. It's not a game. And this is one of the reasons why we tell people on a regular basis that I personally, as an imam with social work background, with social sciences, psychology background, with community experience, I do not understand the phenomena, the reality that we see sometimes in our community, wherein people are talking to more than one person at the same time with the intention of seeing if there's some compatibility to build the relationship. I understand the logic. You understand what I'm saying? I understand why people are doing it. But I don't understand how it is that they can actually be doing it and really think that they're going to truly get benefit out of the process of talking to someone with the intention to get married. I don't understand how that is going to work for them, because to truly filter people out and to truly see if you're compatible with that person, it takes time, energy, and investment. And so if you're doing that same thing with multiple people, that means you're not really committed to the process of getting to know someone to see if it is that we can get married. Now, that brings in the discussion with regard to how much time should you give the person, and that's going to vary. There's no easy way, people, to work through this. And because we're not serious about construction of marriage in our community in today's time, or the foundation of marriage, we find a lot of younger people and even some older people going through these processes like this, and they're ending up at zero after talking to 15, 20 people sometimes, after being on this matchmaking service and that matchmaking service, and having this series of phone numbers and that series of phone numbers, after going into this person's DM and after looking for this other person online, how it is that we're coming up at zero. We can't just blame culture and family. That has something to do with the psychology that people have and their understanding of how to conduct relationships. And so, or how to initiate a relationship. So something is wrong, in that regard. So that 100 question survey that comes at the end of the book is about compatibility. That's something which people should become familiar, so they know what kind of questions to ask. You don't have to do 100 questions exactly, but it's a tool which you should know what you're looking for, so that in your discussions with that person that you may have interest in to get married, you know what you should be looking for. You understand what I'm saying? And it gives you an idea of what direction you should go in. And that's why I find the book to be powerful, because it is built on real life experience and not just ideas of religiosity or how to be a good Muslim without understanding how to implement them. And also it considers the idea of psychology and so on and so forth. And so the books will provide stories of situations which have occurred, which are based on real life situations, with the information that details those people or identifies them being eliminated. In other words, you'll find stories, but it's not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to know who the person is. So the way that we're going to work this is we're going to look at a chapter at a time. But before going into each chapter, we're going to look at the reflection questions, the questions for discussion first, so that we can trigger our thought. And then we're going to look at the summary. That way we have the clear and before us what are the main points. And then we're going to outline the more detailed parts of the chapter. For us, a lesson. The section that's coming next in the next session is going to be dealing with the Quranic model for relationship. And that may take us maybe about 2-3 lessons, to be honest with you. It may take us about 2 or 3 lessons. And then after that, reasons for, why we get married. That is going to be something which is complicated as well. At North Hudson Islamic Educational Center, we are available. You'll be able to call into the masjid if you want to deal with more detailed issues. As we said, this is part of a marriage preparation program, and we would like people to take it serious, right? And to work through these topics and these issues before jumping into a relationship. If you haven't already gone through this process, some people have gone through this process. If you're in a relationship and you want to enhance your understanding of what it means to be in a relationship before jumping into marriage. In other words, if you're talking to someone with the intention of getting married and you want to refine your understanding of how to better that relationship, and we also suggest this for you. We suggest this for parents, as they are raising their children. So they have some ideas of how they talk to their children on marriage in a formal way, not just a customary way, but in a formal way. So one of the first things that we do have to understand is the reality of the Quranic model for the family. And I want to close by saying that Allah Ta'ala in Surah Al-Rum told us that from His signs, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ أَنْ خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, that Allah Ta'ala, from the signs that have been presented to us as being from Allah, is that He created from us, from the same origin, our companions, right? And so that means that there's some compatibility with us. That means that we have been created to be able to be with each other and live with each other. But what kind of living? لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا, so that our souls, right, find tranquility in each other, right? We find peace and tranquility. وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مُوَدَّةً, and Allah Ta'ala placed between us, generated between us, engendered between us love, وَرَحْمَةً, and mercy, right? And then Allah reminds us, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, that indeed in that are signs for those people who reflect. And with that, we come to an end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.